Some people were never meant to fit inside the blueprints others drafted for them. And when they start building skyscrapers on land that was labeled barren, the silence from the critics becomes louder than applause. The calculations that tried to define you were based on outdated formulas. They didn't account for divine anomalies or the weight of sacred timing. Now the same mouths that once spat doubt are choking on confusion, unable to explain how the impossible became your starting point. No one saw it coming because they were looking in all the wrong directions. They expected noise, spectacle, and drama. But you emerged like a sunrise after a blackout, quietly overwhelming, slowly undeniable. The shift didn't come with announcements. It came with presence. And the very people who dismissed you as background static are now rewiring their entire understanding of what power looks like when it isn't desperate to be seen. It wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It was you refusing to collapse under forecasts that predicted your erasure. You weren't a variable they bothered to consider. But now, you've become the constant in every conversation. The map has changed. And the roads you carved with invisible ink are showing up under the cosmic light of a moment no one thought you'd survive, let alone master. What looked like stillness was actually calibration. What they mistook for delays were divine rehearsals. They never realized the ground beneath them was shifting, not because of earthquakes, but because something ancient in you started to move. They mocked the silence, but it was your signal. And when you finally stepped forward, it wasn't into their spotlight, it was into your atmosphere. They tried to explain you away using small words and tired cliches. But you don't fit in footnotes or disclaimers. You rewrote the thesis. The blueprint that carried your name wasn't drawn on paper, it was encoded in destiny. And now that your emergence can't be contained by their logic, all that's left is the stunned quiet of people realizing they weren't just wrong, they were witnessing something they had no language for. People underestimated what happens when patience partners with power. You moved without broadcasting, built without begging, and healed without headlines. And now the echoes of your effort are arriving in ways that can't be faked or copied. This isn't your moment of luck, it's the aftershock of every decision you made when no one was clapping. While they calculated outcomes using their old models of success, you were tapping into coordinates written in stardust. Their math couldn't measure your momentum because it wasn't built on data, it was built on destiny. They watched for proof and missed the prophecy. But now, as you rise beyond their understanding, the only thing left for them to do is revise their reality, or be erased by it. There's a rare kind of soul that doesn't just bounce back from pressure, they absorb it, repurpose it, and rise with new layers of brilliance no one saw coming. While others waited for collapse, what unfolded was a quiet surge, an ascent no equation could trace. Every attempt to define the ending became a miscalculated prologue. The very forces meant to weaken you ended up sharpening your design, not through resistance, but through recalibration of essence. Some transformations don't wait for applause or safe weather. They happen midstorm, while the ground shakes and assumptions shatter. It wasn't about bearing difficulty, it was about converting it into new structure. Every disappointment, every delay, every door that slammed was used as raw material for an internal reconstruction. There was no bouncing back, there was forward motion crafted in silence, a quiet evolution that caught even the sky by surprise. This was never about surviving, it was about transfiguring. Not through some polished narrative of never giving up, but through a brutal refinement that rewrote your emotional DNA in real time. There was no blueprint for what you were becoming because your architecture had never existed before. And so what they mistook as tolerance for pain was actually the blueprinting of a design that required friction to be born. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, let that love shine. Click the super thank you button and give $40 or more to plant seeds of faith that will impact countless lives. Your generosity reflects His abundance, Be a vessel of His grace and watch His kingdom flourish through you. There is something deeply unnerving about witnessing a person refuse to fracture where fracture was predicted. When someone takes the weight meant to bury them and builds a throne instead, old belief systems go into crisis. It wasn't defiance that startled them, it was the absence of fear. Because fear is what they understand. But you weren't reacting, you were activating. And activation, in its purest form, can't be measured by those who never evolved past reaction. The illusion of who you used to be is collapsing fast. They thought they were watching you grow, but it was never growth, it was emergence. Every version of you that played along, kept quiet, stayed soft, that was camouflage. It wasn't deception, it was observation. While they broadcasted certainty, you collected data. While they reached for visibility, you reached inward. So when the shift came, it wasn't a shock to you. It was a release. It's not the new version of you that rattled them, it's the realization that this version was always there. Hidden not out of shame, but out of strategy. You didn't hide to protect them, you hid to protect timing. And now that the moment has arrived, they're scrambling not just to adapt, but to reconcile the fact that their understanding of reality was deeply flawed. You weren't late, you were arriving precisely where mystery placed its bet. The disruption you caused wasn't from noise, it was from clarity. Clarity that stood still while the world spun in assumptions. The emergence of your truth has become an existential dilemma for people who need boxes to feel secure. If they were this wrong about you, what else might they be blind to? You didn't just prove them wrong. You made them question if they ever truly knew how to read someone right. And that kind of reckoning hits deeper than any argument ever could. Some awakenings don't just enlighten, they expose. The more you stepped into alignment, the more they were forced to confront what they abandoned along the way. Your progress wasn't a spectacle to them, it was a spotlight turned inward, showing them every unopened door they once stood before and quietly walked away from. Every layer of your growth peeled back something in them they had been trying to keep buried. Milestones don't just mark success, they become timelines for comparison. With each moment you expanded, they shrank further into the outlines of lives they never had the nerve to redraw. What they felt wasn't jealousy in its purest form, it was the ache of remembering. Remembering that they, too, once had the same fire, before they traded it in for safety labeled as responsibility. Your rise acted as a silent countdown clock for everything they put on pause. What complicated their reaction wasn't hatred, it was tension. Admiration tangled with regret. Respect blurred with resentment. They weren't reacting to your story, they were being confronted by theirs, and the way it unfolded without the risks you were willing to take. It wasn't personal in the way they wanted to believe. It was historical, spiritual, psychological, etched in the gap between what they wanted and what they dared to reach for. Your journey didn't just challenge what they believed about you, it reawakened every decision they made out of fear disguised as logic. And each step you took toward freedom echoed like a haunting in their memory. The quiet courage you moved with was louder than any speech they ever gave about why they stayed still. You weren't trying to remind them of anything, but the truth doesn't need intention to trigger recognition. Control often masquerades as care. Influence wears the costume of guidance. At some point, they mistook your consideration for dependence, and your silence for surrender. What shook them wasn't your defiance. It was your indifference. Because the moment you stopped orbiting their opinions, their illusion of significance started to disintegrate in real time. There's a specific kind of confusion that hits when someone realizes they were never part of the core structure, just temporarily included in the scaffolding. Their relevance in your story was never guaranteed, it was granted. And when that access was revoked, not out of anger but evolution, they began to spiral, not because you changed, but because they had mistaken proximity for permanence. The most unsettling truth they face now isn't your distance, it's your peace. They prepared themselves for your rebellion, your resistance, even your rage. What they never saw coming was your silence becoming permanent. When you stopped needing their applause to move forward, they had to face the uncomfortable fact that they were no longer the audience your soul was performing for. That's what broke the spell. Some lives unfold with such rare precision that even those who don't believe in timing begin to question their clocks. Moments arrived for you not with delay or chaos, but with surgical alignment. Pathways emerged without demand. Introductions turned into alliances. The momentum defied their logic. What they called random events became undeniable sequences, too consistent to ignore, too tailored to be chance. They watched with narrowing eyes as the rules they trusted began to malfunction in your presence. The formulas that shaped their worldview failed to interpret your progress. Single instances could be dismissed, once, twice, maybe 3 times. But repetition became revelation. Patterns appeared that no spreadsheet could predict. Every unexpected yes, every well-timed opening, slowly rewrote what they believed about effort, merit, and luck. This wasn't just about someone doing well, it was about something larger working through you. A rhythm beyond human making pulsed behind your every advancement. And that rhythm clashed violently with their belief that reality is fixed, linear, and earned only through measurable exertion. What unfolded around you demanded a new vocabulary. Their language of probability no longer applied. They were forced to confront a truth that stripped their control. Not all rise is manufactured. Some rise is sanctioned. And when that realization landed, it shook them at the foundation. Resistance against you stopped feeling strategic. It started feeling dangerous. The more they pushed against your current, the more disoriented they became, like trying to hold back a tide with open hands. What they failed to anticipate was that pressure doesn't always collapse a person, it sometimes clarifies them. Their efforts to contain you gave you contrast. Their refusal to believe in your vision sharpened it. The tools they used to slow you down became signals for direction. They weren't holding you back, they were unknowingly guiding your precision. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The blocks they placed were turned into bridges. The setbacks they crafted taught you new speed. What they designed to trap became a map. Each time they intervened, they handed you new layers of ability, until your entire arsenal bore their fingerprints. And nothing could be more crushing than realizing their own resistance wrote the instruction manual for your escape. This is the kind of defeat that doesn't announce itself. It drips in slowly, like water leaking from the ceiling of certainty. They didn't just lose control of your story, they lost the illusion that they ever had control to begin with. Every failed attempt to shrink your world only widened it. And now they're left holding broken tools that once shaped others, realizing too late that your architecture was never theirs to design. The moment your energy recalibrated, the entire field around you responded. What once drew in confusion and projection now began to attract clarity and alignment. The type of people arriving in your atmosphere no longer came to extract, they came to amplify. Not out of obligation, but resonance. Not to fill voids, but to walk with purpose alongside your unfolding. People who carried wisdom instead of warnings began to cross paths with you. Individuals with hearts sculpted by experience, not bitterness, started to notice your frequency. Their presence revealed the stark difference between alliances formed from survival and connections birthed from vision. You weren't just switching environments, the very ingredients of your ecosystem were changing. This wasn't about popularity. It was about elevation. The contrast between who entered your life now and who once held space there made one thing painfully obvious: your field had expanded beyond what their fears could follow. They remained entangled in circles that recycled excuses while your circle spun new blueprints for futures not yet imagined. What they felt wasn't isolation. It was irrelevance. The warmth once shared was gone, replaced with a silence they couldn't decode. While you were moving through synchronized moments of divine design, they were stuck trying to breathe life into expired patterns. Their narrative had no pages left to write in your chapter. The book had moved on. Abundance began to orbit your decisions. Without chasing, without proving, without forcing. The more you stepped into truth, the more unseen currents carried support to your doorstep. What arrived wasn't always loud, but it was always accurate. Whether in the form of insight, timing, or resource, the response was always, "Here's what you're ready for." The truth they refused to face for so long finally cracked open with a force too calibrated to be coincidence. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. The signs had been there the whole time, they just lacked the stillness to read them. What was once dismissed as delusion now stood tall as reality. And what they thought was your potential was just your baseline. Realizing they were never the architects of your path was the collapse. The illusion of control faded into dust, leaving behind only the outline of their misunderstandings. They hadn't been holding you back, they had been orbiting a power source they couldn't comprehend. The shift they feared wasn't new. It was old truth finally stepping into its rightful shape. Some realities arrive like tidal force, undeniable, uncontainable, unstoppable. The moment you stepped into full presence, the illusion that once held you small began to fracture under its own weight. What they're feeling now isn't confusion, it's a recalibration of perception. Their entire framework for what's possible is glitching under the pressure of who you've become without their permission. Encounters with you now carry tension they can't name. You walk into rooms as someone they thought they understood, only to reveal dimensions they were never qualified to measure. Each word, each glance, each quiet refusal to shrink disturbs their internal compass. And that disturbance isn't temporary, it's structural. Because they're not just seeing a person differently, they're seeing themselves differently, too. The space you occupy now was never built by committee. You didn't scale ladders. You didn't follow templates. You shifted gravitational pull. They're witnessing what it looks like when internal alignment overpowers external permission. This wasn't supposed to happen in front of them. And yet, here it is, blooming without apology in the middle of their disbelief. Every hesitation they projected onto you is now screaming at them in reverse. All the times they suggested slowing down, being realistic, or staying grounded, they were offering outdated maps to someone who wasn't traveling roads at all. They didn't just miscalculate your potential, they imposed architecture where sky was always meant to be. What's unraveling now is the story they told themselves about knowing better. They played the role of advisor, gatekeeper, realist, never realizing they were standing in front of something that answered to none of those roles. Their reassurances, once wrapped in concern, now echo as dismissals. And what hits hardest is the realization that their caution didn't protect you, it delayed you. The most painful part of their awakening isn't that they missed the signs, it's that they actively muted them. The right connections were discouraged. The aligned moments were ignored. The doorways they told you not to enter were the very thresholds that led here. They stood between you and your own emergence, thinking they were offering guidance, not realizing they were attempting to interrupt a signal far older than either of you. And now, as the full shape of your becoming unfolds in front of them, their only option is silence. Because argument can't exist where truth already took root. You didn't evolve to prove them wrong. You existed to become undeniable. And now that undeniability is blooming, slowly, wildly, beautifully, while they scramble to rewrite the parts of the story that never belonged to them in the first place. Some people mistake the length of time they've observed the world for depth of understanding. But watching isn't knowing. And proximity doesn't translate to clarity. They interpreted their own exposure as enlightenment, not realizing they were still operating from a grid that couldn't detect frequencies like yours. They saw patterns but missed purpose. They heard noise but missed signal. The ideas they pushed forward were designed for systems you were never meant to participate in. The structure of their advice came from stories where the main character doesn't fly. Now, as they attempt to rewrite their part in your story, the desperation in their tone is impossible to miss. They want to be associated with the outcome they doubted, clinging to revisionist memories that flatter their own judgment. Suddenly, they were mentors. Suddenly, they knew all along. They insert themselves retroactively into chapters they never contributed to, attempting to turn warnings into wisdom and interference into insight. But the timelines betray them. The energy betrays them. The way they treated your becoming is etched into the emotional record, and no amount of spin will disguise that. They'd rather create an alternate memory than accept the reality that their perception failed entirely. It's not that they couldn't see, it's that they assumed they already had. They spoke over you, not with you. They advised from projection, not connection. And now, in the harsh light of your emergence, their so-called guidance reveals itself for what it truly was, limitation dressed up as logic. Every story they told you about what was practical or realistic now sounds hollow, even to them. They layered doubt on top of your dreams and called it protection. They dimmed your fire with caution and mistook it for care. But what they were really doing was grounding something they didn't have the vision to believe could rise. Even now, they scramble for language to reframe the past. But the air around you doesn't accept distortion anymore. The weight of who you've become sits heavy against the version of events they once clung to. There's no merging the two. What happened is what happened. And in the eyes of the universe, that record is sealed. Their stories won't alter the truth. The moments they advised retreat are still echoing. The conversations where they praised smallness still exist. Their inability to stretch beyond their own comfort zones remains frozen in the past, a monument to the miscalculation. And now, they're left standing in the rubble of their certainty, watching as the future they once warned you against becomes your floor instead of your ceiling. Some people can't handle the brightness of someone who steps outside the rules they've quietly accepted. The discomfort isn't caused by your progress, it's caused by what that progress says about the places they refuse to go. You didn't just succeed. You disrupted the entire ecosystem they built to justify why they never even tried. Each step you took beyond the invisible walls they swore were real became a confrontation they couldn't avoid. You forced them to consider whether the bars they grip are made of steel or story. And as you kept walking into wider dimensions, their confined comfort began to resemble a stage set more than a structure, hollow, scripted, and easily dismantled. What you revealed isn't just your potential. You revealed the artificial ceilings hanging over their heads, ceilings they defended with pride. Their supposed realism now echoes like a superstition. Their certainty, once offered like gospel, is unraveling in the presence of something they never accounted for, evidence that they were never limited by life, only by belief. This shift destabilizes more than ego. It corrodes their sense of control. How do you explain away someone who bypasses every rule you warned them about? How do you maintain authority when someone you dismissed just redefined what was possible in plain sight? The narrative collapses. The roles dissolve. The excuses turn to dust in their mouths. You became the counterexample they feared would exist. The walking contradiction to everything they taught. You weren't defiant, you were free. And that freedom turned their blueprint into fiction. The systems they clung to offered comfort but no transformation. What you embodied exposed the true cost of staying safe, stagnation with a name tag. They're no longer doubting your journey, they're doubting their own. Because if the world responds to inner alignment more than effort, if reality stretches for those who no longer need permission, then what else might be available to those willing to rewrite their core assumptions? That question doesn't just challenge their mind, it burns through their worldview. And now, every time they replay the advice they once gave you, every time they recall their well-meaning warnings, they're not met with pride, but silence. A silence that holds the shape of what they never reached for. And in that silence lives the truth. They weren't trying to protect you from failure. They were trying to protect themselves from watching you rise beyond everything they settled for. Something in your field has shifted beyond recognition. There's a quality in the atmosphere around you that refuses to stay unnoticed. People sense a change before they hear your voice. The air feels charged, their thoughts rearrange without instruction, and what once felt fixed begins to feel fluid. You walk in, and gravity bends differently. You don't just change the room, you activate it. It's not charisma. It's not timing. It's something far more difficult to name, an unseen architecture behind your presence that pulls hidden doors open. The right people show up. The next step reveals itself without a map. It's not magic, it's resonance. You've become a beacon for the kind of movement that lives outside conventional motion. Those around you are encountering outcomes without inputs they recognize. They're disoriented by how life reorganizes itself in your direction. Their logic wasn't designed to compute your emergence. They stare at the results and can't trace the equation. What they're really witnessing is someone plugged into a circuit they didn't even know existed. You've become the embodiment of a future few have the language to describe. Your actions hint at dimensions beyond their charts, where traditional strategies lose relevance. They weren't prepared for someone who doesn't just reach new levels, but operates from entirely different dimensions of influence. You don't play their game. You replace the board. This expansion isn't just personal, it's generational. You weren't sent to improve a broken model. You were sent to dissolve it entirely. Your growth isn't just growth, it's correction. The very structure of how potential is measured begins to dissolve in your wake. People thought they understood power until you showed them what alignment makes possible. What you represent disturbs those who thrive on confinement. Your rise suggests their ceilings were optional. Your decisions whisper to others, you don't have to play small. And that whisper spreads like static, low but impossible to unhear. You're not just breaking norms. You're contaminating fear with possibility. And that's what makes your presence dangerous to outdated systems. They now live with the awareness that someone like you exists. Someone who refused the script, declined the limitations, and still thrived. That awareness alone is enough to shake everything they once considered safe. Because if your life is real, then so is everything they were told to suppress. And that truth, once felt, can never be unfelt. There's a certain kind of presence that doesn't beg for attention, it rearranges the storyline. What they mistook for background energy was the origin of the entire plot. You weren't orbiting anyone else's narrative. You were anchoring your own. And now, they're realizing that every scene they thought was about them was simply a setting for your unveiling. They weren't guiding your path, they were reacting to it. Their appearances weren't pivotal, they were peripheral. The events they assumed they influenced were already calibrated long before their opinions arrived. The flow of timing, the collapsing of detours, the unfolding of alignment, all of it moved on an internal compass they couldn't read. This wasn't achievement born from hustle. It wasn't momentum born from approval. It was inevitability carved into the script of existence. Your entire being carried a code they couldn't decrypt until it activated in real time. And now that it has, every casual dismissal they offered echoes back like an ancient warning they never took seriously. They thought greatness announces itself with volume. But your emergence was designed to whisper until it roared. No spotlight, no marketing, just consistent truth stretching itself wider and wider until it couldn't be denied. The shift wasn't in your personality. It was in your frequency. And their frameworks couldn't hold it. They weren't blind because they lacked sight. They were blind because they expected the extraordinary to resemble the familiar. They were listening for thunder, but your becoming sounded like silence. And now they sit in disbelief, realizing that the one they overlooked was the source of every recalibration they're now living through.